There is a place that exists beyond the reach of clocks, beyond the noise of the modern world, where the earth itself seems to breathe with ancient rhythm. Close your eyes, and let yourself be carried there now, to a land of pale limestone hills and wide open skies, where the air smells of wild thyme and sun-warmed dust, and where every sunrise has been, for thousands of years, a quiet act of faith. This is the land of ancient Israel. And if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear it. The first thing you notice, arriving in this world, is how completely the land shapes everything. Not in the way that geography shapes a modern city, where roads are built around hills and rivers are bridged and tamed, but in a far more intimate, far more unforgiving way. Here, the land does not simply surround daily life. It is daily life. It determines when you wake, what you eat, how far you walk, how much you worry, and how deeply you pray. The climate of ancient Israel was not a gentle one. It was a land of two seasons, a wet season and a dry one, with very little in between. The rains, when they came, were precious beyond measure. The dry months that followed were long and relentless, baking the earth into a pale crust and turning riverbeds into white channels of stone and silence. Water was not something the people of this land took for granted. It was something they thought about every single day. It shaped their architecture, their agriculture, their religious imagination, and their deepest understanding of what it meant to receive a gift from God. To live here was to understand, in the most practical and embodied way possible, that life was fragile, and that abundance was never something you could manufacture on your own. The connection between human survival and divine blessing was not merely a theological idea in ancient Israel. It was written into the soil itself. A good rainy season meant full granaries and healthy flocks and children with round, well-fed faces. A drought meant something else entirely. And so the people prayed for rain with a kind of sincerity that only those who truly need something can manage. The productivity of the land, its willingness to yield grain and fruit and pasture, was understood as a reflection of the relationship between the community and the God who had given them this place to dwell. Blessing was not abstract. Blessing tasted like ripe figs warm from the tree. It smelled like barley bread baking on a hearthstone. It sounded like water pouring into a cistern after a long, dry summer. Most people in this world were farmers. Not farmers in the sense of large mechanized operations or distant, impersonal industry, but small, intensely local farmers who knew every rock and furrow of their particular patch of ground, who had inherited the land from their fathers and their fathers' fathers, and who understood the soil the way you might understand a difficult but beloved companion. Agriculture was not simply a profession here. It was identity. It was heritage. It was calling. The land that these farmers worked was, in many places, extraordinarily challenging. Ancient Israel was not a land of flat, easy plains. Much of it was hill country, rocky, terraced, demanding. To grow crops on slopes that would otherwise simply wash away with every winter rain, the people learned, over many generations, to build terraces. They cut horizontal shelves into the hillsides, shoring them up with carefully placed stone walls, creating level platforms of earth where olive trees could put down roots and where wheat and barley could stand upright without sliding into the valley below. Walking through the hill country of ancient Israel, you would see these terraces climbing the slopes in great, sweeping tiers, a testament to patience, ingenuity, and a people's absolute refusal to be defeated by geography. Each terrace represented years of labor, sometimes generations of it. And the maintenance of those stone walls was a never-ending task, passed down from parent to child like a sacred obligation. The crops that grew on these terraced hills and in the wider valleys below were the heart of daily sustenance. Ancient Israelite farmers cherished above all what later tradition would call the 7 species, those particular foods through which the richness of the Promised Land was said to be expressed: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, dates. These were not merely foods. They were symbols, gifts, the very vocabulary through which the land spoke of its fertility. When a family sat down to a meal that included bread made from their own wheat, oil pressed from their own olives, and a handful of dried figs from a tree their grandfather had planted, they were participating in something that felt, to them, deeply holy. The land was not a resource to be exploited. It was a relationship to be honored. But the rains did not always come at the right time. And even when they did, the dry season was long, and the ground could hold only so much moisture before it surrendered to the sun. Water management was therefore one of the great practical arts of ancient Israelite life. A household, a village, a community that understood water, that knew how to collect it, store it, and use it wisely, was a community that would survive. One that did not was a community that would not. The cistern was one of the most important inventions in the story of human settlement in this land. Carved into the bedrock beneath homes and courtyards and hillsides, cisterns were underground chambers designed to collect and hold rainwater that ran off rooftops and paved surfaces during the wet season. What made them work? What transformed them from simple holes in the ground into reliable reservoirs was plaster. Lime plaster, carefully applied to the walls and floor of the cistern, sealed the porous stone and prevented the precious water from simply seeping away into the earth. This technology, developed and refined over centuries, changed everything. It meant that a family could survive the long rainless months on what they had stored. It meant that communities could settle in places that had no nearby spring or river. It meant that the geography of habitation expanded, pushing into drier and more remote territories that would otherwise have been impossible to call home. You can picture them on a rainy winter evening, a farmer and his wife standing at the mouth of their cistern, listening with quiet satisfaction to the sound of water running in through the channel cut into the courtyard floor. Each drop was a small act of providence. Each inch of rising water was another week of security laid by against the dry summer ahead. They would replace the stone cover carefully, perhaps with a word of gratitude, and return inside to the warmth of the hearth. Not everyone in this ancient world was a farmer with a fixed plot of terraced hillside and a cistern carved beneath the family courtyard. Long before the towns and villages of later centuries took shape, the people of this land, and their ancestors stretching back to the earliest pages of the biblical story, had lived in 2 very different ways. And the Bible acknowledges this difference right from the very beginning, in one of its oldest and most haunting stories. Cain was a farmer. Abel was a shepherd. 2 brothers, 2 ways of life, 2 offerings laid before God. The story is shadowed by violence and sorrow, but embedded within it is a simple recognition that these 2 modes of existence, the settled agricultural life and the mobile pastoral one, were both ancient, both honorable, and both fundamental to who the people of this land were. The tension between farmer and herder, between the one who stays and the one who moves, runs like a quiet thread through much of the biblical narrative. It is the tension between rootedness and freedom, between the security of the known and the openness of the road. Shepherding was not a lesser calling than farming. It was a different one, with its own rhythms, its own demands, and its own kind of knowledge. A shepherd did not know the land through a single terraced hillside. A shepherd knew the land across vast distances, every valley where green grass could be found in the spring, every hillside spring that ran clear even in midsummer, every rocky shelter that could protect a flock from a sudden storm. Shepherds moved with their animals through the seasons, following the pasture as it shifted, spending long days and long nights in the open air, watching over their charges with a vigilance that never really switched off. The great figures of the Hebrew Bible were, many of them, shepherds. Abraham tended flocks. Moses spent years in the wilderness pasturing sheep before he encountered the burning bush. David, the greatest king in Israelite memory, was called from the hills around Bethlehem where he had been keeping his father's flock. There was something about the shepherd's life, its solitude, its responsibility, its intimacy with the natural world, that seemed to form a certain quality of soul. A patience, a watchfulness, a willingness to walk long roads for the sake of those in your care. For those whose lives were built around flocks and movement, the question of shelter had a different answer than it did for the farming family with their stone-walled house. A shepherd who traveled with his animals through the seasons needed a home that could travel with him. And so he lived in a tent. Tent life was not considered primitive or unfortunate in the ancient world. It was simply another way of being at home, a way that carried its own dignity, its own aesthetic, and its own practical wisdom accumulated over countless generations. The tents of the ancient pastoralists were typically woven from the hair of the very animals whose well-being was their daily work. Goat hair, dark and coarse and strong, was spun and woven into heavy panels of cloth that formed the walls and roof of the tent. And this material had a remarkable property. When the winter rains came, the goat hair fibers would absorb the moisture and expand, tightening the weave until the surface became almost entirely waterproof. The tent that might feel somewhat drafty in dry weather would become a snug, rain-shedding shelter the moment the skies opened. There is something quietly wonderful about this, the idea that the very material designed to protect against rain would activate and tighten in the presence of rain, as though it remembered its purpose. Inside a well-made tent, life could be surprisingly comfortable. Rugs and woven mats covered the ground. Cooking happened at a small fire near the entrance, with the smoke drifting out through the gap between the front flap and the ground. Rolled sleeping mats were stacked to one side during the day. Bags and pouches of food and tools hung from the tent poles. It was a life organized entirely around portability, every possession chosen for its lightness, its usefulness, its ability to be packed and moved at short notice. Nothing was owned that could not be carried. And perhaps because of this, the relationship to material things was different from that of the farmer who built his house into the hillside and expected it to stand for generations. Movement, in fact, was woven into the fabric of life in the ancient biblical world in a way that is difficult for us, with our fixed addresses and our mapped and measured world, to fully appreciate. People moved. They moved often, and they moved far. Families relocated in search of better pasture or to escape famine, as Abraham's family did when they traveled from Ur to Canaan and then down into Egypt. Caravans of merchants and their laden animals made long, slow journeys across the deserts and through the mountain passes that connected the great civilizations of the ancient world. Pilgrims walked to sacred sites. Refugees fled from conflict. Young men went out to seek their fortunes and sometimes, years later, found their way home. Migration was not an exceptional event in this world. It was a recurring pattern. The very identity of the Israelite people was forged in the experience of migration. The long journey from slavery in Egypt through the wilderness to the land of promise is the central story of the Hebrew Bible, and its imagery shaped everything that came after. To be a wanderer was not a disgrace. To have once had no fixed home was not something to be ashamed of. In fact, the Israelites were regularly commanded to remember their own ancestors' wandering when they dealt with strangers and sojourners in their midst. because they themselves had once been strangers in a land that was not their own. And so it was, in this ancient world. A world shaped by limestone hills and scarce water, by terraced fields and careful cisterns, by the smell of goat hair tents drying in the morning sun after a night of rain, by the slow footsteps of a shepherd following his flock across a hillside lit gold by early light, and the steadier footsteps of a farmer walking out to check on the progress of his barley before the day grew too hot. It was a world that asked a great deal of its people: patience, labor, ingenuity, faith. And in return, it gave them something that is harder to put a name to: a rootedness in the real, a knowledge of where food came from and what water meant, a sense that the earth was not simply the ground beneath their feet, but a living partner in the great, slow work of survival and gratitude. Let the image of that ancient morning settle over you now. The sky lightening above the hills. The first birds beginning to move. Somewhere, a cock crows. A farmer rises, wraps himself against the early chill, and steps outside to read the sky, looking for the signs that his fathers taught him, signs of wind and cloud and season. Somewhere else, a shepherd stirs in his tent, listens to the quiet breathing of his flock, and prepares to move on. The day in the ancient land is beginning. And there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, except rest here a while and let it unfold. As the morning light spreads further across that ancient landscape, touching first the highest points of the hills, then slowly descending into the valleys below, it begins to reveal something that the darkness had kept hidden. Scattered across the hilltops, perched at the edges of ridges and rising ground, are the villages. Small clusters of pale stone buildings, quiet at this early hour, their flat rooftops catching the first warmth of the sun. Smoke is just beginning to rise from one or two of them, thin, gray threads unraveling into the brightening sky. The day is waking up, and the villages are waking with it. There is a reason these settlements sit where they do, high on the hills rather than down in the more comfortable, more easily farmed valleys below. It is the same reason that has guided the decisions of people building homes in uncertain landscapes for as long as there have been people building homes at all. From a hilltop, you can see what is coming. You can watch the roads. You can observe the movement of strangers across the valley floor long before they arrive at your doorstep. The high ground is not the most convenient ground, nor always the most fertile. But it is the ground that gives you time to prepare, time to decide, time to protect the people who depend on you. And so the villages of ancient Israel claimed the high places, settling into the contours of the limestone ridges as though they had always belonged there, as though the hills had simply been waiting for them. These were not large places, by any measure we might apply today. Many of them were extraordinarily modest in scale, home to only a few hundred people at most, and sometimes considerably fewer. A cluster of families, perhaps, all connected to one another by blood or by the long shared memory of having worked the same land together through many seasons of hardship and harvest. You could walk from one end of such a village to the other in a matter of minutes. You would know every face you passed. You would know whose grandmother had been ill through the winter and whose eldest son had recently taken a wife. You would know the sound of each family's particular goats. Nothing here was anonymous. Everything was known. The smallest of these villages, in the earliest periods of Israelite settlement, were often unwalled, open to the hillside air, without the kind of defensive fortifications that surrounded the larger, more prosperous towns of the region. This was not necessarily a sign of carelessness or naivety. In many cases, it simply reflected the reality of how security actually worked in the ancient world. A small rural village did not need to be a fortress unto itself, because it was not entirely unto itself. It existed in relationship, a careful, sometimes complicated relationship, with the larger towns and regional centers that lay within a day's walk or less. Those larger settlements, with their stronger walls and their more organized resources, served as anchors for the surrounding countryside. When genuine danger threatened, the people of the smaller villages knew where to look. They knew which town's walls could shelter them, which regional center had the storage and the manpower to offer real protection. In return, the villages contributed to the economic and agricultural life of the region, bringing their grain and their oil and their animals into the larger markets, paying their dues, acknowledging the authority of those who held power over the surrounding land. It was a web of mutual dependence, imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable, but fundamentally binding. No village was truly alone, no matter how remote it might seem when seen from a distance against its quiet hilltop sky. Within the village itself, the organizing principle was not politics or commerce. It was family. Everything in the life of an ancient Israelite village was understood through the lens of kinship, of who you were related to, who shared your lineage, who bore the same ancestral name and carried the same inherited obligations. The village was not simply a collection of individuals who happened to live in the same place. It was a living network of family ties, woven together over generations, in which every person understood their place and their responsibility to the whole. This kinship logic shaped even the physical arrangement of the settlement. Families did not simply build their homes wherever a convenient space presented itself. They built in relation to one another. Extended family groups, grandparents, adult children and their spouses, unmarried siblings, perhaps a widowed aunt or an elderly uncle, tended to cluster their homes around a shared open space. A common courtyard, bounded on several sides by the walls of the surrounding houses, became the heart of daily life for the whole extended family group. It was not a grand or formal space. It was simply the place where things happened, where animals were kept overnight, where grain was ground and bread was prepared, where children played and women worked and men gathered in the evenings to talk about the season and the harvest and the news that had come in with the last traveler through the village. The courtyard was, in many ways, the most important room in the house, even though it had no roof. Its open sky let in the light that would otherwise have been scarce inside the stone-walled rooms surrounding it. Its hard-packed earth floor absorbed the spilled water, the scattered grain, the ashes from the outdoor fire. It was simultaneously a kitchen, a workshop, a stable, a nursery, and a meeting place. The boundaries between work and rest, between public and private, between human space and animal space, were far more fluid here than anything our modern sense of domestic order would recognize. A family's donkey might sleep within earshot of its owners. The grinding of grain might begin before sunrise, filling the courtyard with its low, rhythmic sound while the rest of the house was still waking. Life happened here, all of it, without apology or partition. The homes that surrounded these shared courtyards had a characteristic form that archaeologists have found repeated across ancient Israelite sites throughout the region, a form so distinctive and so consistently present that it has come to be known simply as the four-room house. It was not a grand design. It was a practical one, evolved to suit the specific needs and materials of this particular landscape and this particular way of life. Picture it from above, as though you are a bird circling slowly over the village in the early morning light. The house is roughly rectangular. At the back is a broad room running the full width of the building. Leading forward from that back room are three long, parallel spaces, two narrower ones on either side, and a wider central one between them. The whole thing is enclosed by outer walls of stone, thick enough to provide insulation against the heat of summer and the cold of winter nights, and interrupted only by a doorway facing the courtyard. That is the essential shape of it. For spaces plus the central area, built from the limestone that lay, in most of this hill country, simply waiting to be gathered and stacked. Stone was the foundational building material of the ancient Israelite world, and for good reason. It was everywhere. The same rocky hillsides that made farming so laborious were also, in a very literal sense, a quarry. Every field that was cleared of stones to make it plantable produced material that could be used to build walls. Every terrace that was constructed to retain the soil generated a supply of dressed and undressed limestone. Stone required no distant sourcing, no expensive import, no specialized tools to obtain. It asked only for patient labor and the kind of practical knowledge about how stones fit together that was passed down within families as naturally as the names of the ancestors. The walls went up first, broad at the base, solid, shaped from field stones and larger cut blocks where they were available, mortared together with mud or lime. Then came the roof, and here the stone gave way to wood. Timber, branches and rough-hewn beams, sometimes of more precious materials in wealthier homes, was laid across the tops of the walls, spanning the width of the rooms below. Over the timber, layers of brush and reeds were spread, and over those, a thick layer of packed earth and clay was applied and smoothed and left to bake hard in the sun. The result was a flat roof. Not the sloping, tiled, rain-shedding rooftops we might imagine when we picture a home, but a perfectly flat, perfectly usable horizontal surface directly above the living spaces below. And flat roofs in this ancient world were not simply a structural feature. They were rooms in their own right, open-air extensions of the domestic space that could serve a dozen different purposes depending on the time of day and the season. Grain was spread on the flat roof to dry in the summer sun. Flax was laid out to rot in the heat. On warm nights, family members might carry their sleeping mats up the stone staircase on the outside of the house and sleep out under the wide, star-scattered sky, catching whatever breeze moved through the darkness. The roof was where you went to watch the sunset, to look out over the village and the valley and the hills beyond, to have a private conversation away from the busy courtyard below, or simply to breathe the cooler air of evening after a long, hot day. Some homes were built with an additional enclosed chamber, a room accessible by ladder or stair, built above part of the ground floor space, tucked under the slope of an extra section of roof. These upper chambers appear in various places in the biblical narrative, spaces of privacy and retreat in a world where genuine solitude was otherwise difficult to come by. A guest room, a place of prayer, a space where something important could happen away from the flow of daily household life. Even in the most modest of homes, the aspiration towards some kind of private space, some room of one's own, even if only just barely, seems to have been present. And the homes of ancient Israel ranged considerably in what they could offer their inhabitants. Not every family lived in the same degree of comfort, and the archaeological record makes this plain. Some houses were simple and spare, for rooms of rough stone and packed earth floors, functional and honest, providing shelter and little more. Others were notably more spacious, with additional rooms built on as the family's fortunes grew, with courtyards that were larger and better maintained, with floors of beaten lime plaster rather than bare earth. And in the homes of the genuinely wealthy, the houses of merchants, officials, landowners, those who had accumulated enough to build not merely for necessity but for comfort and display, something altogether different could be found. Cedar paneling on interior walls, fragrant and rich and imported at considerable expense from the great forests of Lebanon far to the north. Painted plaster, colored in decorative patterns, brightening the interior walls in ways that would have been striking against the general palette of stone and earth that characterized the village landscape. These details appear in the biblical text as markers of luxury, and the prophets sometimes spoke of them with a certain edge, as evidence of excess in a society where many had very little. To panel your walls in cedar while your neighbor struggled to keep grain in his cistern was a thing that attracted comment. But in most homes, whatever their size and whatever their degree of comfort or want, the coming of evening brought the same quiet transformation. The light that had filled the courtyard all day, that generous, uncomplicated Mediterranean light, faded and withdrew. The sky over the rooftop passed through its extraordinary evening colors, and then the stars came out, and the darkness settled over the village like a heavy cloth. Inside, the answer to darkness was the lamp. Small, simple, and entirely beautiful in its way, a shallow clay dish, often no larger than a cupped hand, pinched at one side to form a channel for a wick of twisted flax or plant fiber. Into this dish was poured olive oil, the same oil that came from the trees on the terraced hillsides, the same oil that seasoned food and anointed bodies and played its part in acts of worship. Set alight, the wick drew up the oil and burned with a small, steady flame that cast a warm and limited circle of golden light into the room around it. It was not a bright light. By the standards of our electrically illuminated world, it was barely a light at all. But it was enough. Enough to see the faces of the people gathered around the hearthstone. Enough to work by, carefully, with hands that already knew their task so well that they barely needed to see. Enough to tell stories by, which is perhaps the most important thing of all. The shadows that gathered at the edges of those small circles of lamplight in the ancient Israelite home were deep and warm and full of presence. And the people who sat within those circles of light were close together, closer than we often manage to sit in our larger, brighter, more separately lived lives. One lamp to a room was common. Perhaps two, in a larger household or on an important evening. Each one carefully tended, its wick trimmed, its oil replenished, because to let the lamp go out was to surrender the room to a darkness that was absolute and complete, with none of the ambient glow of streetlights or screens that makes our own darkness so much gentler than theirs. And so the village settled into its night. Lamps burning low in the four-room houses clustered around their shared courtyards. Animals quiet in their enclosures. Children asleep on their mats. The sound of a mother's voice, perhaps, finishing a story that had been started before the last lamp was trimmed. The stars overhead, brilliant and close above the flat rooftops, the same stars that the shepherd out on the hillside was looking at from beneath his goat hair tent, the same stars that the farmer would read in the early morning when he rose to gauge the weather before heading out to his terraced fields. The village, this small and intimate and unhurried place, holds all of them, knows all of them by name. It is a world in which you are never quite alone, and never quite without the weight and the warmth of belonging, to a family, to a courtyard, to a hillside, to a land that asks much of you and, in its best seasons, gives back more than you dared to hope. Rest here a while, among the stone walls and the lamplight. Let the ancient darkness settle gently around you. There is nothing to do now but breathe slowly, and let the village hold you in its quiet. The darkness above the village does not fade all at once. It retreats slowly, reluctantly, the deep black of midnight softening first to a deep blue, then to a gray that is neither night nor morning but something suspended between the two. The stars, one by one, lose their sharpness. The outline of the hills to the east becomes visible, a darker shape against a slightly lighter sky. And then, before the sun has shown even the first edge of itself above that horizon, before the birds have fully committed to their morning chorus, before most of the village has stirred from sleep, there is a sound. It is low and rhythmic and steady, a grinding, circular sound, repeated over and over with a patience that seems almost meditative. It rises from one house, then from another nearby, then from a third across the courtyard. It is the sound of the grinding stones at work, and it means that the day has already begun for the women who kneel before them, turning grain into flour, turning the raw harvest into the stuff of bread and life, as their mothers did before them and their mothers before that, in an unbroken chain of daily labor that stretches back further than any living memory can reach. This is how morning announces itself in the ancient village. Not with a bell or a trumpet or the mechanical shriek of an alarm, but with the sound of work already underway, quiet, purposeful, and as natural to this world as the birdsong that joins it a little while later. The household economy of ancient Israelite life was, in the most fundamental sense, a local one. What the family needed, the family largely produced. What they ate grew, in most cases, within walking distance of the door. What they wore was spun and woven within the walls of the home or close by. The systems of supply and distribution that define modern life, the vast, invisible networks through which food travels thousands of miles from field to table without any of us needing to understand or participate in a single stage of the process, did not exist here. Everything that sustained life had to be obtained, prepared, and maintained by the hands of the people who needed it. And this simple fact shaped everything about what a day looked like, what a woman's hands did from dawn to dusk, what a man's back endured from the first plowing of spring to the last gleaning of autumn. The farming families who made up the backbone of ancient Israelite society were people who understood seasonal time with a depth and precision that we have largely lost. The year was not divided into equal, abstract quarters. It was divided into the realities of the land, into the early rains and the late rains, the plowing season and the sowing season, the weeks of watching and waiting while the grain grew, the urgent, communal intensity of the harvest, and then the long, careful work of storing and preserving against the months ahead. Miss a window and you might go hungry. Work with the season and work hard within it, and the land might reward you with enough. Fields were spoken of in practical, embodied terms. Their size was measured not in abstract units of area but in the amount of seed needed to sow them, a field of 1 core of barley, or 2, or 5. This was a measurement that told a farmer immediately what he needed to know, how much seed to set aside, how much labor to plan for, roughly what yield to hope for. It was a system rooted entirely in the agricultural realities it described, a system that made sense only to people whose daily lives were organized around the planting and harvesting of grain. The collection of water was not a seasonal task. It was a daily one. Regardless of the time of year, regardless of what other work was pressing and what other demands the day might bring, water had to be fetched. The cistern needed to be checked. The jars needed to be filled. In villages that had access to a spring or a well, the water source became one of the great social centers of daily life, a place where women gathered in the early morning or the cooler hours of late afternoon, carrying their large clay jars on their heads or balanced on their hips, exchanging news and conversation while they waited their turn at the source. The walk to the well and back, with a full jar, was often considerable. It was heavy, careful work, the kind of work that builds a particular kind of strength in the shoulders and the neck and the long muscles of the back over years of repetition. In the dry season, when the demands on the water supply were greatest and the available water was least, this daily task took on an edge of anxiety that would have been entirely familiar to anyone who lived through it. The woman who managed the household's water supply was managing one of its most critical resources, and the knowledge and care she brought to that management was as important to the family's survival as any other form of labor. Water, once fetched and stored, was used with an economy that our own habits of abundance make almost unimaginable. Nothing was wasted. The water used for washing vegetables might water the small kitchen garden near the courtyard wall. Every jar was filled to its brim and covered carefully against dust and insects. The cistern's level was watched as closely as a shepherd watches the sky for signs of coming weather. Beyond the daily necessities of water and food preparation, the household was also a workshop. The same stone-walled rooms and open courtyard that sheltered the family at night became, by day, a space of continuous practical production. Crafts were not a separate domain of life, something done by specialists in dedicated workshops apart from domestic space. They were woven into the fabric of everyday household time, fitted into the gaps between meals, pursued during the cooler morning hours, continued by lamplight in the evenings when the outdoor work was done. And crafts, like everything else in this world, were shaped by what was available locally. You built with the stone that lay in your fields. You made tools from the iron or bronze that could be obtained from the traders who passed through, or repaired them yourself when they broke. You shaped clay into the vessels your household needed, the storage jars, the cooking pots, the small oil lamps, using techniques passed down within families, fired in simple kilns or open fires, decorated or plain depending on the time available and the occasion they were made for. The material world of the ancient Israelite household was a made world, in the most direct sense of that word. Nearly everything in it had passed through someone's hands. But of all the crafts that sustained household life, none was more central, more time-consuming, or more completely woven into the daily rhythm of women's work than the production of cloth. To wear clothing in the ancient world was to wear the result of an enormous investment of human time and labor. There were no looms turning out fabric by the mile, no mills producing thread in industrial quantities, no market stalls piled high with ready-made garments available for a small coin. Every piece of clothing that covered every body in every village had been produced by hand, from raw fiber to finished fabric, in a process that could take days or weeks for a single garment. It began with the animal, with the sheep whose wool was shorn in the spring, or with the flax plant whose long stems were harvested from the field and then soaked and dried and beaten until the fibers were released and ready to work. The raw fiber was cleaned and carded, drawn out into a rough preparation for spinning. Then came the spindle, that ancient, elegant, almost meditative tool, a weighted shaft that the spinner kept in near constant motion, twisting the fibers into thread with her fingers while the spindle hung and turned in the air, or was braced against her thigh as she walked, or was worked in the quiet hours before the rest of the household woke. A skilled spinner could produce thread almost continuously, with a part of her attention that seemed to operate independently of whatever else she was doing, watching children, tending a fire, listening to a conversation. The hands knew what to do and did it. The thread, once made, went to the loom. Looms in the ancient Israelite world were typically simple but effective, a frame of wood, with a warp thread stretched vertically or horizontally, the weft thread passed back and forth through them by a shuttle, building up the fabric row by row with a slow, satisfying patience. The sound of a loom at work, the beat of the comb pressing each weft thread tight, the soft thud of the shuttle passing through, was as ordinary a sound in the ancient household as the grinding of grain or the crackle of the cooking fire. Wool produced a warm, durable fabric, excellent for the outer garments and cloaks that needed to withstand the cold nights and the rough outdoor work of daily life. Linen, cooler, lighter, taking dye differently, was prized for garments worn close to the body and for the finer pieces that marked a degree of prosperity or care. The making of either demanded not just skill but time, and the management of that time, weaving around all the other demands of household life, was itself a form of daily artistry. What emerged from this long process of fiber and spindle and loom was not merely fabric. It was a garment that represented weeks of a person's life and labor, and that was therefore treated with a care and a respect that our own relationship to clothing, disposable, replaceable, bought cheaply and discarded easily, rarely asks of us. Clothing was mended and mended again before it was given up. It was passed down. It was treasured. A fine garment was a genuine possession of value, something that could be given as a gift, used as a pledge, or left as an inheritance. And of all the garments in the ancient Israelite wardrobe, none was more important or more versatile than the outer cloak, the large, enveloping garment worn over the inner tunic, draped around the body against the wind and the cold. By day, it was protection and warmth. It marked status and identity. It could be spread on the ground as a seat, used as a sack for carrying goods, or wrapped around a child against the evening chill. And by night, it became a bed. For the shepherd sleeping out on the hillside, for the traveler who had not reached shelter before darkness fell, for the poor man with little else to call his own, the cloak was the difference between a cold night and a bearable one. You wrapped it around yourself and pulled it close and lay down on the ground or on your mat, and the same garment that had dressed you through the day became the blanket that kept you through the night. This doubling of purpose was so fundamental, so built into the understanding of what a cloak was, that the biblical law took explicit note of it. If a man's cloak was taken as a pledge against a debt, it had to be returned to him before sunset. Not as a legal technicality, but as a simple recognition of human need. Without his cloak, a poor man had nothing to sleep under. And the night in this land, even in summer, could be cold. There is something deeply moving, when you sit with it quietly, about the texture of this daily working life. The grinding stones turning in the grey pre-dawn. The spindle turning in a woman's fingers through the long afternoon. The shuttle passing back and forth through the warped threads in the lamplight of evening. These were not glamorous acts. They were not the kinds of deeds that make their way into history or into scripture. They were simply the unending, unglamorous, absolutely necessary work by which life was sustained and families were clothed and fed and kept together against the cold and the dark. And yet there is a quiet heroism in it, if you look. In the woman who rose before the sun to feed her household. In the farmer who knew his fields by the feel of the soil under his sandals and the weight of the seed in his hand. In the shepherd who wrapped his cloak around himself on a cold hillside and trusted the stars to keep their course above him until morning. The work was hard, and the days were long, and the margins were thin. But the rhythm of it, the deep, repetitive, seasonal rhythm of work and rest and work again, carried within it a kind of steadiness that is its own form of peace. Let that rhythm hold you now. The slow turn of the grinding stone. The soft beat of the loom. The day's work settling into the quiet of evening. Let your own breathing find that pace, unhurried, steady, sufficient. And rest. The work of the hands, as we have seen, was never truly separate from the work of the spirit in this ancient world. The grinding stone and the loom, the cistern and the terraced field, all of these were understood not merely as practical necessities but as part of a larger conversation between a people and the God who had placed them in this particular land, under this particular sky, with these particular gifts of soil and season to steward. And nowhere was that understanding more vivid, more joyful, or more completely expressed than in the moment when the labor of the whole year arrived at its fullness, when the grain stood ripe in the fields and the grapes hung heavy on the vine and the figs were dark and sweet on the branch, and it was time, at last, to bring it all in. Harvest was not simply a busy period in the agricultural calendar. It was a theological event. The abundance that appeared each year, or the scarcity, in the harder years, was read as something meaningful, something spoken. To walk into a field of ripe barley and feel the full heads brushing against your hands was to receive something. To gather the first sheaf of the season and hold it up in the clear morning air was an act that carried, for the people of ancient Israel, the weight of gratitude and wonder and the long memory of wilderness years when there had been nothing but what fell from the sky. The festivals of the Israelite year were not imposed upon the agricultural calendar from outside. They grew from it, organically, as naturally as the crops themselves. The timing of the great sacred gatherings was the timing of the harvests. You could not fully separate the religious life of this people from the cycle of sowing and reaping, from the smell of new grain and fermenting grapes and ripening fruit. The sacred and the agricultural were, in the deepest sense, the same conversation. The barley harvest came first. Earlier than wheat, ready to cut while the spring air still held some of the freshness of the rainy season, the barley harvest opened the whole great sequence of the agricultural year with a moment of ritual significance that reached into the heart of the most important festival in the Israelite calendar. Passover, the feast that remembered and reenacted the liberation from Egypt, the night of departure, the great journey from slavery into freedom, was tied to the barley harvest in ways that wove together memory and season, history and earth. The offering of the first sheaf of barley before any of the new crop could be eaten was an act that placed the whole harvest under the sign of thanksgiving, an acknowledgement that the first fruits belonged not to the farmer who had labored for them but to the one who had made the labor fruitful. There is something quietly beautiful about this. The idea that before you can eat the new bread, before you can enjoy the reward of the season's work, you must first hold up what you have received and acknowledge where it came from. It was a discipline of gratitude built directly into the harvest itself, so that the joy of abundance and the practice of thankfulness could not be separated from each other. And at the center of everything, as it had been at the center of mourning in the village and at the center of the household's daily labor, was bread. Bread in the ancient Israelite world was not one item among many on a varied table. It was the table. It was the foundation and the substance of every meal, the thing around which everything else was arranged, the food that was so fundamental to survival and daily life that its presence was synonymous with food itself and its absence was synonymous with hunger. To break bread was to eat. To lack bread was to go hungry. When the Bible speaks of God providing for His people, it speaks again and again in the language of bread, daily bread, bread from heaven, bread in the wilderness. The image carried its full weight precisely because everyone who heard it knew, in their body, what bread meant. Barley bread, in much of the biblical period, was the bread that most people actually ate. Barley was the humbler grain, the hardier one, the one that could grow in poorer soils and drier conditions than wheat could manage, the one that the ordinary farming family was more likely to have in their storage jars than the finer, more prestigious wheat. Wheat was also grown and eaten. The biblical landscape knew both, but wheat flour made a lighter, better-tasting loaf and was consequently more valued, more expensive, more associated with prosperity and celebration. The barley loaf was the bread of everyday life, the bread of the poor and the ordinary and the hard-working, and there is no shame in it. It was solid and sustaining, and it kept people alive through long days of physical labor in a way that nothing else could match. Alongside the bread, and in many ways as fundamental to the daily table as the bread itself, was oil. Olive oil. Pressed from the fruit of those ancient, gnarled trees whose roots went deeper into the limestone hillsides than anyone could measure, gathered in the autumn after the long summer of ripening, crushed in the stone press until the golden oil ran freely into the collecting basin below. Olive oil in the ancient Israelite household was not a luxury. It was a necessity so basic that to be without it was a kind of poverty all its own. It went into the bread dough and onto the bread once baked. It was the medium in which vegetables and pulses were cooked. It flavored the simple dishes that made up most meals. It filled the clay lamps that pushed back the darkness each evening. And beyond its culinary and practical uses, it carried a sacred significance that elevated it above mere food. Oil anointed kings and priests. Oil was poured on the heads of those set apart for special purposes. Oil was offered in the temple. The same substance that a woman poured into a lamp or worked into a dough was the substance through which holiness was marked and consecrated. In a world where the sacred and the everyday were always in conversation with each other, olive oil was one of the places where they met most naturally. The table, or more accurately, the mat spread on the floor or the low surface around which a family gathered for their meals, held much more than bread and oil, of course. The ancient Israelite diet was a varied one, shaped by the full range of what the land could produce and what could be stored through the lean months without spoiling. Lentils were among the most ancient and most reliable of foods. Small, hardy, storing beautifully when dried, they could be kept in clay jars for months and retrieved whenever needed, softened in water and simmered over the fire into thick, nourishing stews and porridges that warmed the body through cold evenings and gave the working person the sustained energy they needed for another day of physical labor. The Bible's most famous lentil story, the red stew for which Esau sold his birthright, speaks to something real about the appetite that follows a long day outdoors, the way a bowl of something hot and savory could seem, in a moment of exhaustion and hunger, worth almost any price. Broad beans and chickpeas rounded out the legume staples of this ancient kitchen. Dried and stored like lentils, they were enormously practical, bulking out stews, providing protein in a diet where meat was not a daily presence, feeding a family through the lean periods between harvests when the grain stores were running low and the new crop was still weeks from being ready. Vegetables of various kinds, grown in the small kitchen gardens tucked against courtyard walls, traded in village markets, gathered in season from the wild plants of the hillside, added color and variety and vital nourishment to the daily diet. Garlic and onions, leeks, cucumbers. These appear in the biblical text as things remembered with longing by a people in the wilderness, and the specificity of that longing tells us something true about how central they were to ordinary daily meals. But it was the fruits of this land that gave the table its moments of pure delight. The fig tree was everywhere in the ancient Israelite landscape, growing in gardens and on hillsides, its broad-lobed leaves providing deep shade in the summer heat and its fruit ripening in long succession through the warm months. From the first early figs of early summer through the main harvest of late summer into the dried fruit that could be pressed into cakes and stored for winter. To sit under one's own fig tree was, in the biblical imagination, the very image of peace and sufficiency, a shorthand for the life of safety and abundance that was the deepest human longing. Pomegranates were among the jewels of the ancient table, their thick, leathery skin splitting open to reveal the extraordinary interior, packed with hundreds of seeds each enclosed in its own jewel of sweet tart juice, ruby red against the white membrane. They were beautiful enough to serve as decorative motifs on priestly garments and temple pillars, and delicious enough to be listed among the 7 species that most perfectly expressed the bounty of the Promised Land. Dates, likely produced from the great date palms that grew in the warmer, lower regions of the land, near Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, provided a concentrated sweetness that could be eaten fresh or dried, pressed into cakes, or fermented into a thick, honey-like syrup. Grapes were both food and drink in one. Eaten fresh from the vine in the late summer, sweet and warm from the sun, they were one of the great pleasures of the harvest season, the time when the whole community turned out to bring in the vintage, when the air above the vineyard smelled of ripeness and the juice ran purple on working hands and stained lips. What could not be eaten fresh was dried into raisins, pressed for juice, or, most importantly, fermented into wine. Wine was not a luxury in this world. It was a staple, a daily presence at the table, mixed with water and drunk with meals, offered at celebrations and sacred occasions, stored in great clay jars in the coolness of the storage room against the long months ahead. Honey was spoken of in the Bible as the sweetest of all good things, part of that enduring image of the Promised Land as a place flowing with milk and honey, abundance made edible and poured out for the people. Wild honey, gathered from the nests of bees in rock crevices and hollow trees, was a prize that rewarded the sharp-eyed and the brave. It could sweeten a dish, preserve fruit, coat a dried fig cake in a layer of golden richness that would have seemed, to a palate accustomed to the plain flavors of daily food, almost extravagantly wonderful. Milk and its products were woven throughout the daily diet. Goats and sheep provided the most common milk, thicker and richer than what we might expect, turned by the warmth of the climate quickly toward fermentation. Yogurt-like preparations, soft fresh cheeses, dried and salted cheeses that could be stored, these were part of every household's regular provisions, a source of fat and protein and flavor that complemented the grains and pulses at the heart of every meal. The Bible describes Abraham setting out a meal for his 3 mysterious visitors that included milk and fresh cheese alongside bread and roasted meat, a meal that reads, across all the distance of the centuries, as genuinely hospitable, generous, and good. Fish was a presence on the tables of those who lived near the great inland Sea of Galilee or along the coastal regions, or who had access to the trading routes along which dried and salted fish could travel considerable distances from where they were caught. Preserved fish, dried hard, salted, packed in jars, kept well and traveled far, bringing the taste of the sea inland to villages that might be a long journey from any significant body of water. And meat, the roasted lamb, the fatted calf, the bird prepared for a feast, was the food of celebration and occasion rather than of ordinary daily meals. Animals were too valuable in their living state, providing wool and milk and labor and the ability to reproduce, to be slaughtered casually for the table. Meat arrived at the family meal at moments that meant something: a guest of honor at the door, a festival day, a wedding, a sacrifice shared with those who had helped with the harvest. When meat appeared, it announced that this meal was different from ordinary meals. It said that something worth celebrating had happened, or was happening, or was about to happen. And so the table in the ancient Israelite home was, in the end, a place where the whole story of the year could be read. The barley bread that spoke of the spring harvest, the oil that spoke of the autumn olives, the dried lentils that had been stored against this very season, the raisins that were summer grapes transformed by sun and time, the cheese and the wine and the occasional sweetness of a honey-drenched fig. It was not a lavish table by the standards of the very wealthy, in most of the homes where ordinary families ate. But it was a full one, full of the land's particular gifts, full of the season's particular character, full of the labor of the hands that had planted and tended and harvested and stored and prepared. And it was a shared table. Everyone gathered around it, close together in the lamplit room, reaching for the bread from the same common supply, dipping into the same bowls. To eat together in this world was to belong to each other. To share bread was to share something more than food. It was to say, without needing any words for it, that the people gathered here at this moment were bound together, by family, by covenant, by the common daily miracle of being fed. Let that image rest with you now. The lamplight soft on the faces around the low table, the smell of bread still warm from the hearthstone, the quiet sounds of a meal being shared, the gentle movement of hands, the murmur of voices, the occasional laughter of a child. The ancient table, spread with the gifts of an ancient land. There is room at it, always, for one more, and you are welcome here. Rest now, and be still. The meal has ended. The bread has been broken and shared. The oil lamp burns a little lower than it did when the family first gathered, and the quiet of a well-fed evening has settled over the household. But the night is not yet done, because in this ancient world, the ending of a meal was rarely the ending of the gathering. It was, more often, simply a transition, from the act of eating to the act of being together, which was, in its own way, just as nourishing and just as necessary. To understand the social world of ancient Israel, you have to begin with a truth that runs deeper than any individual custom or practice, deeper than the rules of hospitality, deeper than the particular rituals of greeting and welcome that shape daily encounters. The truth is this: in this world, you were never simply yourself. You were always yourself in relation to others, and those relationships were not chosen freely or worn lightly. They were the very architecture of your identity. Who you were was, first and most fundamentally, a matter of family. Your father's name and your father's father's name were not merely biographical details. They were your introduction to the world, your credentials, your explanation. They told anyone who heard them where you fit in the great, branching structure of tribe and clan and household that organized all of Israelite society. They told people what land your family worked, what obligations you carried, who your natural allies were and who might be considered, at least in some distant sense, your kin. To be without family, without a father's house to belong to, without a tribe to claim you, was a form of social nakedness that left a person profoundly vulnerable. The orphan and the widow appear again and again in the biblical text as figures deserving special protection precisely because they lacked the ordinary social armor that family connection provided. Land and family were inseparable in this world. The land your family farmed was not simply a piece of ground. It was your inheritance, passed down through generations, tied to your identity as surely as your name, carrying within it the memory of ancestors who had cleared and terraced and planted it before you were born. To lose your family's land was to lose something more than an economic asset. It was to lose a piece of who you were. The passionate, sometimes anguished concern with land rights and inheritance that runs through so many biblical narratives. Naboth's refusal to sell his vineyard to King Ahab, the careful land laws of the Torah designed to prevent permanent alienation of ancestral holdings, makes complete sense once you understand that land and identity were not separate categories. They were the same category, viewed from different angles. Kinship reached into nearly every significant decision a person might make. Who you married, who you worked alongside, who you turned to in a crisis, who you could expect to stand beside you in a dispute, all of these were shaped, often determined, by the web of family and tribal relationship that you were born into. It was not a system that valued individual autonomy in the way that modern Western culture has come to. It was a system that valued loyalty, obligation, and the coherence of the group. And within that system, you always knew exactly where you stood, and so did everyone else. That universal awareness of where everyone stood was maintained by one of the most powerful social forces in the ancient world, the twin realities of honor and shame. These were not merely feelings or private moral judgments. They were public, communal, and consequential in ways that shaped behavior at every level of society. Honor was the currency of social life. It was earned through generosity, through keeping one's word, through the proper discharge of family obligations, through courage and wisdom and the willingness to treat others with the respect that their own standing deserved. It was confirmed and renewed in public interactions, in the greetings exchanged in the village gate, in the way a man was addressed by his neighbors, in whether people rose when you entered a room or remained seated. And it could be lost, through failure, through perceived cowardice, through the violation of social expectations, through acts that the community collectively judged as falling below what a person of your standing should do. Shame, correspondingly, was not simply an internal experience of embarrassment. It was a social verdict, delivered by the community through 1,000 small signals and sometimes through very explicit acts of public judgment. The awareness that your behavior was constantly visible, that the village saw and noted and remembered, that nothing significant you did passed without comment, was a constant presence in the background of ancient Israelite social life. It was a powerful regulator, not always a just one, and not always a kind one, but powerful and largely inescapable. Nothing moved through a community more quickly, in this world of intimate villages and closely held social knowledge, the news of the events that most touched on family honor and obligation. A birth, a death, a marriage, a dispute, a moment of outstanding generosity or notable failure, these were not private matters. They were community events, known and discussed and interpreted by everyone within the reach of the news. There was no such thing, really, as a secret in a village of a few hundred people who shared the same courtyard wells and market days and festival gatherings. Life was lived in public, or at least in the semi-public space of the extended family and neighborhood, and the consciousness of being seen was simply a fact of existence. Out of this social world, shaped by kinship and honor and the unblinking awareness of community, grew one of the most deeply held and most practically important values of ancient Israelite life, hospitality. Hospitality in this world was not a pleasant social nicety. It was a moral obligation of the highest order, a sacred duty rooted in the understanding that the stranger at your door was vulnerable and that your response to that vulnerability said something fundamental about who you were and who your God was. A world without easy travel infrastructure, without roadside inns on every route, without the safety nets of modern institutional care, was a world in which the traveler depended entirely on the goodwill of strangers for shelter, food, and safety. To withhold that goodwill was not merely impolite. It was a serious moral failure, one that the community would judge and that the biblical tradition repeatedly condemned. To offer it generously, on the other hand, was to participate in something that the tradition regarded as genuinely holy. The stories of generous hospitality in the biblical text, Abraham running to meet his 3 visitors in the heat of the day, the widow of Zarephath sharing her last handful of flour with the prophet Elijah, the Shunammite woman who built a room on her roof specifically so that the prophet Elisha would have a place to rest when he passed through, are told with a warmth and an admiration that makes their value clear. This was what it looked like to live well, to be the kind of person and the kind of community that the covenant called you to be. The physical space of hospitality was, most naturally, the courtyard. That open, semi-public space at the heart of the household compound, the same space where grain was ground and animals were sheltered and children played, was also the space where guests were received and where the life of the household opened itself, carefully and generously, to the world outside its walls. The courtyard was neither entirely public nor entirely private. It was a threshold space, a place of controlled opening, where the interior world of the family could be shared with outsiders without fully surrendering the privacy of the inner rooms. A guest arriving at a household would be welcomed into this courtyard space. Others from the extended family or the neighborhood might drift in as word spread that someone interesting or important had arrived, because a guest with news or wisdom or stories was a genuine event in the life of a village, and the opportunity to sit and listen was one that few would willingly miss. People could settle themselves along the courtyard walls, in the shade of an awning or beneath the open sky, and simply be present, listening, absorbing, occasionally asking a question or offering a response. Women moved through this semi-public space in the service of hospitality, bringing water, bringing food, attending to the practical needs of the guest, and their role in the whole performance of welcome was indispensable. The preparation of a meal for a guest was not a background task. It was a central act of the household's response to the arrival of a visitor, and it required skill, speed, and the kind of practical intelligence that knew exactly what the stores contained and what could be prepared with honor in the time available. But before the meal, before the conversation, before any of the deeper forms of welcome could be offered, there was one act that stood at the very threshold of hospitality itself, simple, practical, and carrying a significance that went well beyond its practical purpose. The roads and paths of the ancient Israelite world were not paved and smooth. They were dust and stone in the dry season, mud and stone in the wet season, always rough, always taxing on the feet that walked them in simple leather sandals that covered the sole and the toe and left everything else open to the world. By the time a traveler arrived at a household after even a short journey, his feet were coated in the dust of the road, white limestone dust in the hill country, darker soil dust in the valleys, the accumulated grime of every step between where he had started and where he now stood. To wash the dust from a guest's feet was to say, without any words, that his journey was over, that he had arrived, that this household received him. It was a declaration of welcome made in the most physical, most grounded, most humble of terms, kneeling before another person with water and a cloth, attending to the part of them that had carried the burden of the road. It was an act that dissolved the distance between host and guest, that acknowledged the traveler's weariness and the household's willingness to receive it. And because it was so universally understood as the first gesture of genuine welcome, its absence was noticed, and its presence, especially when offered with particular grace or humility, was remembered. The biblical narratives are attentive to these moments. They notice who washes whose feet, and when, and with what spirit. They register the small acts of physical care that accompany the larger dramas of the story, because they understand that it is precisely in these small acts that character is revealed, that the quality of a person's heart shows itself not in their grand declarations but in whether they kneel and fill the basin, and take a tired stranger's dusty feet in their hands. This attentiveness to the texture of ordinary life is one of the most remarkable qualities of the biblical text, and it is something worth pausing to notice. The great stories of the Bible, the stories of faith and covenant, of Exodus and prophecy, of kings and battles, and the long drama of a people in relationship with their God, are told through the medium of ordinary human experience with an intimacy and a specificity that keeps them permanently alive. We learn about ancient life not through catalogues or records, but through stories about families negotiating inheritance and identity, through meals prepared in haste for unexpected guests, through the description of a house, a courtyard, a well, a wedding celebration, through the account of a woman grinding grain before dawn, or a shepherd sleeping in a field, or a traveler's feet being washed at the door of a stranger's house. The ordinary is not background in these stories. It is the medium through which meaning moves. It is the water in which the deeper truths swim. And this means that to pay attention to the texture of daily life in the ancient biblical world, to the food on the table and the lamp on the shelf and the dust on the road and the courtyard where people gathered to listen, is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a way of reading more deeply, of hearing more fully, of allowing the ancient world to become something more than a distant and alien backdrop to stories we think we already know. The courtyard is quiet now. The guest has been welcomed and washed and fed. The conversation has ranged through the evening. News from the road, teaching exchanged, stories told and received with laughter and with silence and with a particular attention that people give when they know that what they are hearing matters. The lamp is burning low. The stars are very bright above the open courtyard walls. In a little while, the household will find their sleeping mats and draw their cloaks around them and let the night do its slow, restorative work. The guest will sleep in whatever space the household has made available, warm and fed and safe in a way that was not guaranteed when he set out this morning on the dusty road. This is what hospitality looks like in this ancient world. Not a transaction, not a performance. Simply the opening of a door, the filling of a basin, the breaking of bread, and the deep, quietly radical insistence that the stranger at the threshold deserves to be received as though he matters. Which, in this world, he always does. Let that thought rest with you as the night deepens. The courtyard still, the lamp guttering gently, the village breathing around you in the dark. You are known here. You are welcome here. There is nothing more you need to do tonight but close your eyes and rest. The courtyard has grown quiet in the hours since the guests settled to sleep, and the village around it has stilled into that deep, unhurried silence that belongs only to the small hours of the night, the hours when even the dogs have stopped their occasional commentary and the last lamp in the last household has finally been trimmed to nothing. But morning will come, as it always does, and with it another day woven from the same threads as all the days before it. Work and water and bread and the patient, ongoing business of being a family in this ancient land. And it is family, always, in this world, family, that stands at the center of almost everything. Not family as a pleasant social unit, not family as one choice among others in how a person might choose to organize their life. Family as the fundamental structure of existence. The household was not simply where you lived. It was what you were. And the moment that brought a new household into being, the moment when two people were joined together and a new domestic unit was formed from the two that had given them life, was one of the most significant events in the entire social and spiritual calendar of ancient Israelite experience. But that moment did not arrive suddenly or spontaneously. It was prepared for, negotiated, and established through a process that was as careful and as formal as the building of the stone walls that would shelter the new household. Because what was being built, in every marriage, was not merely a domestic arrangement. It was a covenant. And covenants, in this world, were not entered into lightly. The faith of the household and the life of the household were not, in ancient Israel, two separate things that happened to occupy the same space. They were the same thing, viewed from different angles. The rhythms of daily life, the morning prayer, the blessing before the meal, the observance of the Sabbath rest, the teaching of children in the ways of the covenant, were not interruptions to domestic life or additions to it. They were woven into its very fabric, as natural and as necessary as the grinding of grain or the tending of the lamp. To run a household faithfully was itself a form of worship. To raise children in the knowledge of God was the most important labor that a parent could undertake, and it happened not in a temple or a school but in the ordinary daily life of the family, at the table and the hearth and the courtyard well. This meant that marriage was never merely a private arrangement between two individuals who had found each other agreeable. It was a matter of profound communal and spiritual significance, a joining of households, a continuation of lineage, a new expression of the covenant faithfulness that was supposed to characterize all of Israelite life. And because it carried that weight, the process by which it was established was formal, careful, and thoroughly embedded in the social structures of family, village, and law. It began, as so many things in this world began, with the family. Not with the two young people who were to be married, though they were of course the center of the whole enterprise. It began with their fathers, or with whatever senior family members held the authority and responsibility for the household's affairs. Marriage was, at its most fundamental level, a negotiation between families, a careful conversation about property and lineage and the future of the children who would come from the union, conducted by the people who bore responsibility for those families' well-being and honor. The considerations were real and practical. What land did each family hold? What was the standing of each household in the village and beyond? Were there any complications of lineage or prior obligation that needed to be examined? Was there existing kinship between the families, the preferential marriages to cousins or within the extended clan that the culture favored as a way of keeping land and loyalty within a network of related households? All of these questions had to be considered, because marriage in this world did not simply join two people. It joined two family systems, with all their history and property and obligation, into a new configuration that would have consequences reaching forward through generations. The village was always present in this process, if not always visibly. Nothing as significant as the joining of two households could happen without the community's awareness, and the community's awareness functioned, in its quiet way, as a form of oversight. Everyone knew everyone's family history. Everyone had opinions about whether a particular match was wise or ill-advised. The social network of the village, with all its memory and its judgment and its investment in the honor of its constituent families, was a constant, if unspoken, participant in every marriage negotiation. At some point in the formal proceedings, after the initial conversations had established that both families were willing and that the basic outlines of an agreement were possible, came one of the most important practical elements of the whole process: the gift that the groom, or his family, offered to the bride's father. This gift was called the mohar, and its significance has sometimes been misunderstood by those looking at it from outside the culture. It was not a purchase price. It was not a transaction by which a daughter was sold. It was something more nuanced and more important than that, a formal expression of the groom's family's commitment, a material acknowledgement of the value of the woman being asked to leave her household of origin and join a new one, and a practical contribution to the bride's family that helped offset the real loss of a daughter's labor and presence in the household she was leaving behind. The mohar was part of a broader web of exchange that surrounded the marriage agreement. The bride's family, in return, would typically provide a dowry, goods, clothing, household items, sometimes land or money, that would go with the daughter into her new household and become part of its foundation. The interplay between mohar and dowry, between what was given to the bride's family and what was given with the bride, was a careful balancing act that reflected the relative standing and resources of both households, and that was negotiated with the same attention to fairness and honor that governed all significant transactions in this society. When the negotiations had reached their conclusion, when both families had agreed on the terms and the community had been made aware of what was being arranged, the betrothal itself was established. And here it is important to understand something that the word engagement does not fully convey to modern ears. Betrothal in the ancient Israelite world was not a preliminary stage of the relationship, a period of romantic trial that could be ended with a conversation and an awkward social announcement. It was a legal commitment, binding and serious, with a status in the eyes of the law and the community that was in most respects equivalent to marriage itself. Witnesses were present when the betrothal was formalized. Their presence was not ceremonial. It was legal and social, the community's way of establishing that this commitment had been made publicly, in the presence of those who could attest to it, and that both parties were therefore bound by it. The betrothal was spoken aloud, its terms stated, its witnesses named and present. Nothing about it was vague or informal. It had the weight of a covenant behind it, because that, in the most precise sense, is what it was. The bride was not a passive object in this process. She could receive the covenant verbally, with her own spoken words of acceptance, or she could receive it with the dignified, considered silence that also constituted agreement in the formal conventions of the culture. But she was a participant. Her acceptance mattered, not in the way that a modern romantic sensibility might hope, always freely given and enthusiastically expressed, but genuinely, legally, in the sense that her response was part of what made the covenant valid. She was a person entering a binding agreement, not merely a person to whom an agreement was being done. From the moment of betrothal, everything changed. A woman who had been betrothed was no longer simply her father's daughter, subject to his household and available, theoretically, to another suitor. She was, in the eyes of the law and the community, already her husband's wife in everything except the completion of the wedding itself. Her status had shifted fundamentally. The protection of the covenant covered her now. Its obligations bound her. And if, for any reason, the betrothal were to be broken, if something arose that made it impossible or necessary to dissolve what had been formally established, it could not simply be ended by mutual agreement and a handshake. It required a formal act of dissolution that the law recognized as divorce. The commitment made at betrothal was that serious. The covenant was that real. There is a moment in some accounts of betrothal ceremony that carries a particular beauty, the sharing of a cup of wine between the young man and the woman who was now bound to him, offered and received in the presence of the witnesses and the families gathered around them. Wine in this world was never merely a drink. It was a marker of significant moments, a presence at the table when something important was happening, a way of sealing an agreement with something that engaged the senses, that could be tasted, that left its warmth in the body, that made the abstract reality of a spoken covenant into something momentarily physical and real. To drink from the same cup was to share something, to participate together in a moment that both of them would carry forward into the period of waiting that now lay ahead. Because there was a waiting period. The betrothal established the covenant, but the wedding itself, the formal completion of the marriage, the bringing of the bride to the groom's household, the celebration that would open the new chapter of their shared life, did not happen immediately. There was time between the two events, and that time was not idle. It was purposeful, and each of them had work to do within it. The groom's great task during this period was the preparation of the home. He needed to have somewhere ready to bring his bride, a place that the new household could call its own. In many cases this meant building, or extending, or preparing a new room or set of rooms, often within or adjacent to the family compound of his own father's household. It was understood that the new couple would need their own space, even if they were closely connected to the extended family around them. And the responsibility for having that space ready before the wedding could happen rested entirely on the groom. He could not bring his bride to an unfinished house. The home had to be prepared, the roof made sound, the storage areas set in order, the hearth ready for the first fire. It was an act of provision, of care arranged in advance, a way of saying, in the most practical possible terms, that he was ready to receive her. The bride, in the meantime, had her own preparations underway. The time between betrothal and wedding was the time in which she and her mother and the women of her household gathered and made and assembled the things she would bring with her into her new life. Clothing, woven and sewn with care, representing weeks of skilled work, the finest pieces that the household could manage. Household items. The practical equipment of a new home beginning to accumulate around the woman who would run it. Each item made or gathered was a small act of preparation, a way of moving, garment by garment and vessel by vessel, toward the life that was coming. There is something quietly profound about this image, of two people, separated by the distance between their family households, each working toward the same future from their different positions. He building the place where they will live. She gathering the things that will make it a home. Neither of them fully in the life that is coming yet, but both already moving toward it with their hands and their labor and the daily evidence of their commitment. It is a picture of faith, in its way, of the willingness to prepare for something that has been promised but not yet fully arrived. Of the trust that the covenant entered into at betrothal means what it says, and that the preparations made in the waiting time will not be wasted, because the day of completion is coming. The village knows this story is underway. It sees the building work at the young man's father's house. It watches the women at their weaving, adding to the pile of things being prepared. It holds the whole unfolding process in its communal awareness, tracking it toward the day when the celebration will begin, the day that the whole community will be invited to share, when the new household will be welcomed into being with the full warmth and noise and joy that the culture reserved for its most important moments. But that day is not yet. For now, the betrothal stands. The covenant has been spoken. The cup has been shared. The witnesses have gone home to their own households, carrying the knowledge of what they have seen. And in two separate houses, under the same village stars, two people lie down to sleep with the same future somewhere ahead of them in the dark, and begin, each in their own way, the patient and faithful work of getting ready. Let that image rest with you now. The quiet of the village, the stars above the flat rooftops, the soft sound of someone, somewhere, still at the loom in the late evening, adding one more careful row to the cloth that will become part of a new beginning. The covenant has been made. The work is underway. And the night is deep and still and full of the particular peace that comes from knowing that something good is being faithfully prepared. Rest now. There is time. There is time for everything. The waiting is over. There is a particular quality to the air on the day that everyone in the village has known was coming, a heightened alertness, a brightness in the eyes of people going about their ordinary morning tasks, a sense that today the usual rhythms of work and water and bread are still underway but are no longer the main event. Word has circulated, as it always does in a village where nothing significant escapes the community's awareness, that today is the day. The preparations are complete. The home is ready. The clothing is folded and the household items assembled, and the waiting, that long, faithful, industrious waiting, has arrived at its end. The wedding day has come. In a world where so much of daily life was hard, where the margins between sufficiency and want were narrow, where the body was worn by labor, where grief and loss arrived without warning and often without remedy, the wedding was something different. It was a sanctioned eruption of joy, a moment when the whole community gathered around something unambiguously good and allowed itself, fully and without reservation, to celebrate. Not quietly, not briefly, not with the restrained politeness of a people who were embarrassed by happiness. Loudly, generously, 4 days. Because this was not a private occasion. A marriage in ancient Israel was not a matter between two people and a few close witnesses in a small, intimate ceremony. It was a public event, an event that belonged, in an important sense, to the whole village. The joining of two households was a communal matter, a rearrangement of the social fabric, a moment in the ongoing story of the community that everyone had a stake in witnessing and celebrating. To be excluded from a wedding was a notable absence. To be invited was to be counted among those who belonged to the circle of the family's life. And the celebration that marked the occasion was scaled accordingly, large, generous, open, and sustained over a period of days that might seem extravagant by any practical measure, but that made perfect sense in a world that understood feasting as one of the primary languages in which human beings speak their joy to one another and to God. The friends of the bride and the friends of the groom were active participants in the whole unfolding event, not guests in the passive modern sense of people who arrive, sit, watch, applaud at the right moments, and go home. They were part of the celebration itself, helpers and companions and voices in the singing and the procession and the long, festive gathering that surrounded the central moments of the day. A wedding was a collective performance of happiness, and everyone had a role to play in it. But the heart of the wedding day, the moment toward which everything built and from which everything that followed flowed, was the procession. Picture the evening coming on. The sky above the village moving through its extraordinary colors, the deep gold of late afternoon giving way to orange, to rose, to the soft purple that precedes the dark. The heat of the day beginning to ease. And in the household of the bride's family, a gathering of women, the bride herself, her female relatives and friends, the companions who have been part of her preparation and her waiting, making ready for what is coming. There is oil in the lamps and the lanterns. There is singing already beginning, low and joyful, woven through with the particular excitement of a group of women who know that the night is going to be unlike ordinary nights. Because the procession, in first-century practice, often happened after dark. The groom and his companions would come, not in the flat light of midday but in the velvet blue of evening, their lanterns casting moving circles of warm light across the stone paths of the village, their voices raised in the songs that announced their coming to everyone within earshot. And everyone within earshot was listening. The whole village was, in its way, waiting. Adults on their rooftops and in their doorways, children who were supposed to be asleep but were not, neighbors leaning out to watch the lights moving through the dark lanes between the houses. The lanterns were not merely practical, though they were certainly that on the unlit paths of an ancient village at night. They were beautiful. A procession of lit lanterns moving through the darkness was a sight that carried its own visual poetry. Points of warm gold flame against the deep blue of the evening sky, swaying gently with the movement of the people who carried them, throwing their light onto the faces of those who walked together toward the moment that was coming. Light moving through darkness. Joy announced by flame. It was an image that lodged itself so deeply in the imagination of the culture that it became a way of speaking about much larger things, about readiness, about faithfulness, about the kind of attentiveness that keeps the flame burning even through a long wait. The procession moved through the village with singing. Not the subdued, decorous music of a formal occasion, but full-throated, joyful, communal singing. The songs that belonged to weddings and had belonged to them for generations. Songs that the older women knew from their own wedding days and their mothers' wedding days before that. Songs that the younger women were learning now by singing them. Songs that spilled out over the rooftops and into the night air and told the whole sleeping countryside that something wonderful was happening here. And as the procession made its way along the path between the bride's family home and the new household where she would arrive as wife, there is evidence in the ancient customs of the region that grain might be scattered along the way, handfuls of barley or wheat thrown from the hands of the participants, falling across the path like a blessing, like a prayer spoken in seed rather than words. Grain, in this agricultural world so deeply shaped by the rhythms of planting and harvest, carried its own language of hope and abundance. To scatter grain at a wedding was to invoke the same blessing on the new household that the farmer prayed for over his fields. Fruitfulness, increase, the multiplication of good things, the promise of a future well supplied with what it needed to sustain life and flourish. The path was lit and sung over and blessed with grain, and the bride walked it surrounded by the women who loved her, toward the home that had been prepared for her, toward the life that had been covenanted at the betrothal and was now, at last, being completed. At the house, the home that the groom had spent the waiting months preparing, the home whose roof was sound and whose hearth was ready, the feast was waiting. The wedding feast was not an afterthought or an appendage to the main event. It was itself central to the occasion, as important as any vow or ceremony, because in this world the sharing of food and wine was one of the primary ways that covenants were sealed and communities were knit together. To feast together was to say something real about belonging, to the family, to the village, to the new household being welcomed into existence. The table that was spread for a wedding feast was the largest and most generous that the household could manage, and the honor of the family was expressed in what was offered and how freely it was given. Wine moved through the feast like a current of warmth and celebration. Not the careful, sparing use of oil in the lamp or water in the cistern, but generously, joyfully, because wine at a wedding was not a practical necessity. It was a symbol, a sacrament of the moment. It spoke of joy, as it had spoken of joy at every significant gathering in the life of this people. It spoke of covenant, as it had at the betrothal, when the shared cup had marked the beginning of the formal commitment. And now, at the feast that marked the completion of that covenant, it spoke again, poured out freely among the gathered community, saying without words that what was happening here was worth celebrating fully and without holding back. Food was abundant, or made to appear so, because the generosity of the host was itself a statement of honor and welcome. Bread and oil and the preserved and prepared foods of the household's best stores. The meat that ordinarily appeared only on days of celebration and significance. Whatever fruit was in season. Whatever could be prepared in the days leading up to the event to make the table worthy of the occasion. Guests ate and drank, and the talking and the laughter and the singing continued, and the evening deepened around the lit and festive household without anyone particularly wanting it to end. And it did not end quickly. Wedding celebrations in the ancient world were not affairs measured in hours. They were measured in days. 7 days was the traditional span for a wedding feast in the biblical narrative. 7 days in which the eating and drinking and singing and gathering continued, in which the new household was celebrated not with a single burst of communal joy but with a sustained, rolling festivity that included the whole community over a period long enough for everyone to be part of it and for the significance of the occasion to be thoroughly, unhurriedly marked. 7 days is a long time to feast and sing. It is long enough for the initial excitement to settle into something deeper and more relaxed. The genuine, easy warmth of a community that has gathered around something good and is in no hurry to disperse. Long enough for the older members of the community to tell their stories and for the children to run themselves to exhaustion and fall asleep in corners. Long enough for friendships to be renewed and disputes quietly set aside in the spirit of the occasion. Long enough for the new household, still so new that it has no history yet, no accumulated memory of its own, to be properly welcomed into the life of the village that will surround and sustain it in the years to come. As the evenings of the celebration came on, one by one, the natural movement of life in this ancient world drew people upward. The flat rooftops of the village, those practical, much-used horizontal spaces that by day served as drying floors and work platforms and lookout points, became, in the cool of the evening, something else entirely. The heat that had baked the stone and the packed earth of the roof through the long hours of the day released itself slowly as the sun went down, and the air that moved across the rooftop after dark carried the day's warmth without its intensity, warm enough to be comfortable, cooled enough to be pleasant, infinitely preferable to the close, still air of the rooms below. Families made their way up the outside staircases with their sleeping mats and their cloaks, settling into the open air for the night as they did through much of the warm season. Children were laid down under the vast canopy of the sky and fell asleep with the stars above them, the same stars that had been above every generation of this people since the beginning, the stars that Abraham had been invited to count when God spoke to him about the future of his descendants, the stars that the shepherd watched from the hillside and the farmer read for signs of weather and season. At a wedding feast, the rooftop in the evening was the natural gathering place for those who wanted to linger, to sit together in the cool air after the heat and the fullness of the feast below, to look out over the dark village and the darker hills beyond, to continue the conversations that the daytime had started and that no one was quite ready to finish. The stars above were extraordinary in this world without electric light. The full, undiminished, almost overwhelming splendor of the night sky as human beings experienced it for most of their history on Earth, thick with stars from horizon to horizon, the band of the Milky Way clearly visible as a river of soft light across the dark. To lie on a rooftop in ancient Israel on a clear night and look up at that sky was to feel, with your whole body, both the smallness and the significance of being human. Small beneath that immensity, and yet held by it, known by it, in a universe that the faith of this people insisted was not indifferent but attentive, not empty but full of the presence of the one who had made the stars and called each of them by name. And so the wedding celebration comes to its close, not with a sharp ending but with a gradual, peaceful dissolving. The feast settling into conversation, the conversation settling into the quiet of the rooftop evening, the voices growing softer as the night deepens, the children already asleep, the oldest members of the community wrapped in their cloaks and looking up at the sky with the particular piece of people who have seen many such nights and know their value. The new household exists now. It has been covenanted and celebrated and welcomed and feasted over. It carries with it the grain scattered on the path and the songs sung through the village lanes and the wine shared at the table and the 7 days of communal joy that said, as clearly as anything can be said in this world, that what has begun here matters. That these two people matter. That the life they will build together, the children they will raise, the fields they will tend, the table they will share, the lamp they will keep burning through the ordinary evenings of all the years ahead, is worth celebrating fully and honoring deeply, and surrounding with the warmth of a community that intends to be present for all of it. This has been the world we have walked through together, this ancient, intimate, unhurried world of limestone hills and terraced fields, of stone houses and shared courtyards, of grinding stones and olive oil lamps, of bread broken in hospitality and wine poured in covenant, of families gathered around tables and travelers welcomed at doors and brides carried through the night in the light of lanterns and song. It is a world separated from us by 2,000 years and more. And yet it is not, in the end, so very far away. Because the things that organize this ancient life, the need for shelter and food and water, the desire to belong, the weight of family and the warmth of community, the hunger for meaning, the practice of faithfulness, the instinct to celebrate what is good and to welcome the stranger and to keep the lamp burning through the dark, these are not ancient things. They are simply human things. They are our things, as much as they were theirs. And now the village is still. The feast is over. The procession has long since arrived at its destination. The lanterns have been extinguished one by one. The songs have faded into the warm night air and dissolved among the stars. On the rooftops, the families of the ancient village lie wrapped in their cloaks, their breathing slow and deep, their faces turned upward toward the same sky that arches over you now, wherever you are. The grinding stones are silent until morning. The loom is still. The cistern is full. The lamp burns low in the corner of the room below, a small steady flame that will keep until dawn. Let the ancient world hold you gently now, as it has held all of us, in one way or another, for as long as there have been people who looked up at the stars and wondered, and worked, and gathered together, and gave thanks. The hills are quiet. The stars are bright. The night is deep and wide and full of peace. Sleep now. You are home.